Testing, can you hear me, Ruth? Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar on equine biosecurity. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm the Small Acreage Management Coordinator for the Front Range in Colorado, and I work with both Colorado State University Extension and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And all of our small acreage webinars are made possible by the partnership of these two organizations. Today with me we have Ruth Wilson behind the scenes helping us with the technology, so thanks Ruth for being here. And also I'm happy to introduce Jonathan Vrabach, who's the CSU Extension Agent in Arapahoe County, and he'll be talking with us on equine biosecurity today. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know this webinar is being recorded and will be available within the next few days via the Small Acreage Management website, and I'll send everyone a link to the recording when I get it. Before we get started, let's bring up a poll question just to see how much knowledge our listeners have before Jonathan starts talking. So just kind of rate yourself on what you think you know about equine biosecurity. So it looks like people kind of think they have some knowledge. Well, hopefully after this presentation we'll have very knowledgeable participants. All right, let's close the poll and bring up Jonathan's presentation, and I'll turn the mic over to Jonathan. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. A little bit about myself. I'm the County Extension Agent here in Arapahoe County. I've been involved in the horse industry since the 80s, so it's been a couple of years. Grew up showing horses and raising them. My degree is in animal science with a minor in agriculture and natural resource economics, and then I have a master's degree in extension education from the College of Agriculture at Colorado State University. So I'm excited that you guys are all interested in doing a better job with biosecurity and improving your biosecurity, whether that's at home or when you're going to shows or whatever equine events you participate in, or if you're a facilities manager, just looking for ways to make your facility a little bit more secure in terms of biosecurity. So what is biosecurity? Oh, give me 1 second. I gotta remember how to advance through the slides. There we go. There we go. So what is biosecurity? I was thinking Ruth was in the background there, just going to do that for me. Biosecurity refers to the steps that you can take to reduce the chances of an infectious disease spreading, whether that's through your herd or from facility to facility. And it's a broad term. It encompasses just your basic principles that you're going to employ in your everyday management, the way you go about doing your business, as well as the actions that you put in place or take to improve your biosecurity, and then the protocols that you have in place when it comes time for you to have to deal with a situation or to try to prevent situations. Some of those protocols can be health requirements or how you're going to manage new horses coming onto your facilities and those kind of things. Also, if we will take some questions here at the end of the presentation. So if you guys want to hang on to those, I think it's easiest if we just type those in towards the end, and then I can go back and get those things. But it really boils down to kind of the old saying of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I really believe that in a lot of scenarios in the livestock world. So why is it important? Disease outbreaks can be costly to both the horse owner and the horse industry, and it's also potentially life-altering to the animal. Some of these things cause, long-term neurological effects or weight loss, and those kind of things can affect the performance of the horse. Just a variety of stuff. I ran across, when I was doing research for this presentation, a survey from New Mexico. They showed that it was about $115 per vestibular stomatitis case for each animal's treatment. That's the cost to the owner. That doesn't include the impact on the industry resulting from quarantines and restricted movement and whatnot. And I know $115 at first might not sound like a lot of money, but when you add that up over multiple horses, that can become cost prohibitive. But other diseases, such as equine herpes virus, are ever present. Horses can be carriers of that and not have any symptoms, and then it remains hidden and then reemerges without any kind of warning or anything like that. So diseases can just pop up, and you need to be prepared on how to deal with those things, or how to prevent your horse from becoming infected when it does emerge. Also, biosecurity in the big picture protects the economy, the environment, people and animal health. Biosecurity is a kind of a key term nowadays in all livestock industries, not just the equine industry, but cattle, sheep, hogs, poultry, all along the food chain. Biosecurity is an important aspect of what we do in the animal world. So what are some diseases of concern? I'm sure people can think of the big ones, but I mean it goes as simple as just the common respiratory diseases that horses sometimes get, and then goes to things like the equine herpes virus, strangles, salmonella, pigeon fever, and vesicular stomatitis. And those pictures, when they popped up, they went along with the phrases they popped up with. If you haven't seen those things, there's a chance to see some of the ones that are, well, strangles is more common, but the other two are ones that we always see in the news. I don't know if you guys have heard or not yet, but just got an update from the state vet's office that there's a case of vesicular stomatitis in New Mexico now. Colorado tends to lag about a month behind. It coincides, it seems, with when bugs start to come out. And so New Mexico seems to get it first every year, and then we tend to get it about a month later. So, we'll likely be dealing with that again this year. So biosecurity's role, it's important to remember it does not replace a good disease prevention and vaccination program, but it's really a part of the overall herd health plan that you should have in place for your facility and your equine involvement. But it does not replace a good vaccination program. In fact, the vaccination program is part of your biosecurity measures that you're going to take. Its role is to reduce the exposure and decrease the likelihood of an infection or an outbreak of a disease. It's certainly not going to prevent it, but hopefully we can reduce the likelihood by putting some practices in place. So how are horses exposed to different diseases? We can think of some things, but drinking water and feed is one of the main ways. You want to avoid, I put that picture there intentionally, because you want to avoid situations where you're using communal watering or feed sources. Obviously on your own facility, within your closed herd, that's okay. But it's when you're going places and exposed to horses that aren't on your property that you want to kind of minimize those contacts and don't water or feed your horses communally with the other horses that they're not exposed to every day. Aerosols, that's airborne exposure. That can be from animals sneezing and coughing, where the infection can spread through the air. Contact is obviously nose-to-nose contact. Another reason why I chose that picture to put there is when you're out and about, unless the horses are on the same facility, you want to avoid that nose-to-nose contact or any kind of contact between the other horses that you're around, just to minimize your exposure. Formites, that's just a fancy word for inanimate objects. So that would be the stalls at any kind of fairgrounds or facilities that you might visit, or places to tie your horses, hitching posts on trails, those kind of things. If you're into trail riding, you want to try to avoid those contacts there. And I'll talk about some things you can do, because obviously you can't not put your horse in a stall sometimes when you're at a show or some other kind of event. Insect vectors or wildlife. Obviously, some diseases like West Nile is transmitted from mosquitoes, and you want to that's one way that exposure. And then wildlife, whether that's rodents, moving things from place to place on your property even. Same thing with cats and dogs. I should have just included that in there. Then there's also contact with contaminated surfaces, hands, and clothing. You definitely want to think about these things when you're visiting other equine events and try to minimize the chances of those kinds of exposures. So I kind of labeled this next one everyday biosecurity, or things that you do on your farm. And the very first one is something we've all heard about, and I think we all kind of take for granted sometimes, and that's to quarantine all new and or sick horses. Sick horses should actually be quarantined for about 30 days. New horses, about 2 weeks is okay when coming onto your property. And I know that's challenging to do, but if you're risk adverse and you want to try to prevent these kind of things, somehow quarantining animals that come onto your property, if they're going to be there long term, is a really good practice to employ. Some things to think about as far as where you quarantine them: they need to be about 40 yards away from other animals, other horses, so that they can't just aerosol transmit any kind of disease or anything. And then you want to not share equipment, buckets, apple pickers, fence lines, anything that is in the quarantine area needs to stay in the quarantine area. Don't just take the same wheelbarrow over that you just finished cleaning your horse's stall with over to the new horse and clean that stall and then go back across the rest of the barn with that wheelbarrow. You're just going to end up spreading any kind of disease or infection that the animal might have through those things. So it's good to have 2 different sets of equipment, or you're going to end up having to disinfect the equipment after each use in the quarantine area. And I don't think anybody has realistically the kind of time to do that. I think it's just easier to have 2 separate sets of equipment for that. Other thing things that are really important is good hygiene practices by the caregivers. Again, you might have separate sets of equipment, but you walk over there, you interact with that horse, you touch surfaces and things in that quarantine area, and then you go back and you deal with your other animals. Well, before you do those things, you need to wash your hands, change your clothes, change shoes, or use a foot bath of some kind to practice some good hygiene there and not transfer things from one place to another. One thing that you can do to kind of cut down and minimize on your having to change clothes or change shoes and those kind of things, figure when you're going to work that horse or work with that horse. If you put that horse at the end of the day, then that's the last horse you interact with before going into the house at night. Then you wouldn't have to be as concerned about changing your clothes or cleaning your shoes off and those kind of things. I know that's a challenge, but this is really something that can really affect your success of having a more biosecure facility. I read one, or actually several articles in doing my research for this presentation where they suggest you blow your nose so that you're not just aerosoling it yourself as you go from place to place. So blow your nose before you go into or from one place where you have a quarantined animal to where your other animals are kept. Again, going on to just some more everyday on the farm kind of biosecurity things. Visitor hygiene is really important when people come to your property to visit. If they're coming from a place that has horses as well, you need to either be really secure in the fact that they have the same kind of biosecurity measures in place that you do and that theirs is just as good as yours, or you need to ask them to wash their hands or bring a pair of shoes that they're not wearing every day in their barn to your place so that things don't get tracked there. Vaccination program, again, is really important to work with your veterinarians and have an appropriate vaccination program in place because that prevention piece can't be overlooked. Good nutrition and feed storage. Horses that are in good health with good nutrition, their immune systems are less stressed, and they're in better condition to be able to handle any of these kind of situations should they occur. In addition to that, the food storage practices, that helps decrease rodent and wildlife interactions that could spread disease, whether that's birds getting into your feed supply or rodents taking things from one place to another. The feed storage shouldn't be overlooked. Same thing with, if you have spills and stuff like that, it's really important to try to clean those up, because that just makes your job of trying to manage any of those other vectors that much more successful, because you're just reducing the things that are going to attract them to your place. Good air quality is really important, not to put stress on their lungs, as well as to reduce environmental transmission where things come through just wind. And then the manure management. One of the things to keep in mind about manure management, if you do have a sick or infected horse, do not put that waste onto an open air manure pile. And also don't spread that manure out on your pasture. What you need to do with any kind of manure like that is to compost it. And composting is a whole other presentation that, if you're interested, CSU has lots of information on how to compost properly. But composting can actually, it's the heating up of the waste products to a certain degrees that will ultimately kill some bacteria and some viruses and help make that material safe to then spread and make it useful for those kind of things. But manure management is really important. It also decreases the likelihood of insects being attracted to the area where the horses are. So if you're able to put that manure pile away so that it's not close by where your animals are all the time, that will decrease the likelihood that you have insects transmitting diseases. Again, another thing on the farm, and this is something that people sometimes I think overlook, is to keep good health records. If you're able to track those kind of things and know what your animal's performance is in terms of their normal health, it gives you a baseline so that you're able to recognize when there's a problem a lot sooner. And oftentimes the sooner you recognize that there's an issue, the better off you are. Oops. There we go. My cursor moved off my slide moving button. Monitor the animal's temperature. When I first was doing some of the research for this presentation, I ran across that a lot, and I thought, boy, I'm not sure that's everybody's going to think that's really a practical thing that they can do. But if you have a baseline to know what your animal's normal temperature is, and then when you go places and do things, if you can take their temperature while you're doing those other things, you'll recognize when that temperature spikes. And again, that's one of those forewarning things that can help ward off because of your ability to detect a problem earlier and get ahead of it rather than after it's already got a good hold on the animal. So monitoring your animal's temperature, I now think is something that can practically be done and should be done on a more regular basis. And as a former horse owner myself, I certainly didn't do that very much. I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I actively took my horse's temperature when there wasn't a problem. And looking back, I should have done that more now. Ultimately, another thing, I've mentioned this a couple times in terms of the feed storage and the manure management piece, but controlling those insect vectors and wildlife is really important. And taking care of those things, from the flies to mosquitoes to rodents, can really help prevent some issues from breaking out. My next slide, I'll talk a little bit about insect control. There we go. I've already mentioned one of the main things to do is to remove waste. That's your number one thing you can do. Our county fairgrounds here in Arapahoe County is situated right next to Arapahoe Park. During our county fair last year, we got visited by the state's vet office, wanting to know where our manure pile was and how we were dealing with that, because we were gathering lots of different species of animals in one place in close proximity to where a lot of racehorses are housed, and if we had some kind of outbreak or something like that, it could have a costly impact to that industry, and so you need to be cognizant of those kind of things, and where and what your waste removal plans are, and how you're controlling flies and mosquitoes. Store feed properly. That's one of the main things to do to control rodents. And when I say the word properly, storing it in bags is not always the best practice, because rodents and things can chew right through a bag. So if you have some kind of solid container or feed bunk, that's the best practice, is to put feed in something solid, so that visitors can't get in there and share in your feed. It's also can help the economics of things if you've got a big rodent issue. Obviously, for insects, there's all kinds of sprays out there. Even for insects, there's traps and baits to help get rid of them. But the traps and baits are also very effective against rodents. I've seen things now where they have those sonic things that you plug in that mice and rodents don't care for, and can help deter them from taking up residence in areas. The thing to remember about some of those is you really need to read those instructions, because they don't, if you hang a curtain or have a wall right in front of them, it's not going to pass through that wall, and they only do certain sized areas. And so make sure you read the applications for those things if you're going to use them. But obviously use sprays to deter flies, like in the picture there. If the horses are just out on pasture all the time, I know there are different kind of tags basically that you can hang around the horse's neck or attach to them, not to where you got a halter out in a pasture situation, but where they're kind of like collars that go on that will be long lasting, and there's different rub-ons and pour-ons and things like that can help give them a long lasting effect. One thing to keep in mind with any kind of fly sprays and things like that, as horses sweat, that breaks down the insecticides in those, and they become less effective. So keep that in mind. And also, always remember that anything that you use on your horses needs to be labeled for use on horses, and to follow those labels and use those appropriately. There's reasons those labels are on there. Other things, if you have any kind of standing water, treating that to reduce mosquitoes. They have these dunks, or these little bricks that you put in the water that dissolve, and it will decrease the mosquito larvae from hatching in there. And so you want to try to do that if you have any sort of water. I think we've gone over the West Nile prevention and things for years now in the equine industry, so keep that in mind. Work around your facilities to reduce weeds and grass and shrubs from becoming overgrown. That'll help deter some of those rodents and control some of that as well. And then also, if you have a real bad problem, screens are sometimes something that you can employ to try to keep bugs away from a certain area, especially in your quarantine area. If you could put some kind of screen up just to decrease flies and bugs from getting to that animal and then flying over and getting to one of your other animals, that could be a good thing. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about biosecurity before events. Now, if you're doing all those other things on the farm, that everyday kind of stuff, your biosecurity before an event isn't that much that you need to do, because you're already doing a lot of it every day. But one thing I think people don't always think about is to be up to date on their vaccinations. And by that, you need to vaccinate about 2 weeks prior to going to any kind of event. It doesn't mean vaccinate 24 hours before you go. You need to vaccinate in advance so that your animal has enough time to build up those antibodies before any kind of anticipated travel. And that goes for any of the animals that are left behind as well, because it doesn't do you any good to vaccinate the one animal that's going off to the show or to the whatever event it is, just to come home and bring something back and all the other animals now be susceptible to that. So make sure that everything on your property is up to date on their vaccines in plenty of time prior to any kind of travel, so that they have a chance to build up those antibodies so that you get the use out of your vaccinations. Next is to use a clean trailer. In doing my research, I always thought, well, I kept a pretty clean horse trailer myself, but one of the things that they said is that if your horse trailer smells like a horse, it's not clean. And I was like, boy, I don't know when my horse trailer has ever not smelled like a horse. So doing a good job of cleaning the horse trailer is important for the comfort of the animal while it travels, and then just to reduce the attraction of insects and things like that to the trailer when you get to a new place, so that anything that might be in the area doesn't decide to take up residence there. So when traveling, obviously, I think this one kind of goes without saying, if at all possible, avoid known areas of disease outbreak. And this means not just your ultimate destination, but on your route there. Excuse me. And then avoid commingling and interaction. I mentioned that on that one slide, talking about reduce that nose-to-nose contact when you're at the event, and then use a well-ventilated and clean trailer as well. I didn't mention here, but later on in this presentation, I'll talk a lot about disinfecting the stalls. And one of the things when you get to wherever it is that you're going, actually, it should be on my next slide. There we go. Anyways, going back to the commingling, no nose-to-nose contact, no sharing of equipment. That's brushes, saddle pads, all that kind of stuff can transfer things. Bring water from home. I know that might sound a little bit ridiculous. Currently, in my family, we show sheep currently, and one of the things we do when we go to shows is we haul our own water. That's mostly because sheep are really finicky and they won't drink the water that's there, and the same thing goes with horses for that matter. And so if you're able to bring that water, it helps them stay hydrated, which will help ultimately improve their immune system or keep their immune system healthy. But ultimately, it's that you don't want to use a shared water source, and that goes with hoses that are coming in contact with other people's buckets and watering stuff. You want to try to minimize all of those things. Now, this is what I was getting ready to say when I was on that last slide. But you want to try to disinfect or spray down the stall in some way prior to putting your horse in it. I know when you get to a show, it feels like you're always being rushed to get the horse unloaded, get all the stuff unloaded and everything. But if you're able to get there in advance and disinfect the stall, and I know it's not necessarily practical to think about scrubbing down the entire stall surface, but at least think about the areas where the animal's nose goes all the time, right there at the front of the stall, or if they go put their nose in the back of the stall or wherever, and those areas that are kind of the head height of the animal, if you can at least take care of those, you're at least doing some preventative measures to try to get that stall somewhat clean to try to reduce your risk factors there. Obviously, monitor your horse while you're at the show. That goes back to that taking their temperature so you know what's going on there. And something, it's nice, and we want to be nice to the public, and we're happy that they're there and other passerbys, but you definitely want to discourage them from petting your horses, because they're going to go from stall to stall to stall petting, and may not be washing their hands in between. They could be transferring things from one horse to another. You could use a hand sanitizer. If you want to let people touch your horses, you can put a hand sanitizer there, and at least have them do that to try to decrease the chances that they're carrying anything back and forth. But you definitely want to try to put some measures in place to try to prevent some of that. Remember that when your horse is away from home, they're under greater stress, and so their immune system isn't going to be functioning quite as effective as it normally would be. So at events, you want to try to do everything you can to make them comfortable and to prevent their exposure. That spraying down the stall and doing some cleaning around the stall, I can't necessarily stress that enough, because I think that's a great, because you have no idea what was in that stall before, and that can be a great way to prevent some of these things. So after you travel, I'm including in this one before leaving the event or unloading, once you're back at home and that kind of things, you want to try to do some stuff. One of those things, again, clean and disinfect your equipment. You could consider having one set of equipment that you take to shows and another set of equipment that you use at home. That stuff you just leave in your trailer. It should be cleaned from time to time too, because you just don't want to be transporting things from one place to another anyways. But any equipment that's coming off that trailer needs to be cleaned and disinfected prior to going back into your everyday use at home, just so you're not transporting anything like a hitchhike. They call it hitchhikers in one of the publications I read, where stuff attaches to your equipment and goes back to your place. Other things that they'll talk about is this includes cleaning out your trailer, thinking about your tires, that kind of stuff as well, or parking those away from your everyday traffic areas so that people and other vehicles aren't going through that same area and then transporting it off into your everyday use. Showering and changing clothes and shoes. Again, having two sets of shoes, a set that you're going to wear at shows or events, and another set that you use in your barn every single day, is important to think about so that you're not transporting anything back home. If it's possible, keeping returning horses isolated, meaning no nose-to-nose contact with other horses for 2 weeks, and this is another place where those could be the horses that you work last in the day, so that the ones that stayed home, you get them out of the way, and then work the ones that could be transporting something as they just returned from a show or an event. Work them towards the end of the day just to reduce the chances of anything. Oh, that's the next thing on my slide there. But again, keeping things clean and thinking about what you're bringing back, I think, is the takeaway message here after you travel. Whatever you can do to minimize transporting anything back is a positive thing that you can do to help increase your biosecurity. So let's shift gears here a little bit to events and challenges that event managers and event hosts might have to deal with or think about. One of the things is entry and movement of diseases. Obviously, bringing animals from different places into one facility is always a risk, and that's the risk you take in hosting those. But anything you can do to minimize those things, health requirements and whatnot at a facility, is a good plan. Stressed animals. Obviously, the animals are there. They're there for an extended period of time. They're not at home. Heat can be a factor. Just the fact they're getting worked in a new environment every day, their immune systems are going to be compromised. Environmental spread refers to wind or humidity assisting in the spread of diseases. Good ventilation is important at these kind of things to help reduce environmental spread. And you got to remember that because of the facility, animals are kept in close proximity. Those chances increase because they're in that closed environment closer than what they normally would be. Obviously, it's a challenge to have good biosecurity at an event, and so the lack of biosecurity is something that event managers are challenged with. Anytime you're bringing horses to an event, they're commingling to some extent, and they're commingling with other horses of unknown health, and so that's where that I mentioned already, the health requirements of some kind, or a health check at the gate or anything like that can accomplish to reduce some of those things. It's challenging for just to be a health certificate. Like our state fair here in Colorado usually says the health certificate has to be issued within so many days of the event. Otherwise, just to say a blanket statement of a health certificate being in place on the animal, those can be issued within 30 days of the event, and within 30 days a lot of things can change with the animal. Again, close stabling, I mentioned that a little already. Animal and human movement at events. You've got lots of people walking around and animals going from place to place, wash racks, warm-up pens, or wherever. That movement is going to increase the spread of things. An animal could be walking down a stall and it goes to the bathroom as it goes down the stall alleyway, and now other animals are walking right through that or exposed to that. Those are just challenges that are going to occur at events, and there's no 100% foolproof way to deal with that. One of the things that events are challenged with is inadequate isolation areas. That's something on my next slide that I'll talk about, but having an isolation area in a low traffic, away out of the way area is important. So if there are any sick animals, they can be moved to that area to reduce the interaction and spread of any kind of disease. That can really save everybody that's at the event a lot of hassle if that's in place ahead of time and well thought out. So for event hosts, some main things for biosecurity is to have a plan. Have something in place and have thought about what you're going to do in certain situations and how you want to manage some of these risk factors that are inherent to events. I found some really good resources. I see somebody asked about a checklist down there. There's lots of good things available. There's a business continuity plan for equine events that you can access through the Colorado Department of Agriculture. And I have a list of references at the end of this presentation too. Then California Department of Food and Agriculture put out a biosecurity toolkit for equine events, and that's where I took a lot of the information from this particular slide from. And then UC Davis has a good publication as well. It's called Basic Equine Facility Biosecurity for Horse Owners and Horse Professionals. Those have some good things in there. Otherwise, I think, to some extent, this PowerPoint could be taken and used as a checklist for things to think about that you might want to consider doing. So facility layout assessment, and that's, like I said, out of the biosecurity toolkit. But things like size of stalls, construction, are they wood, which can actually harbor things, or are they made of metal, which is not, it's not a porous surface, and so it can be more easily disinfected. The location of things, such as your isolation area, feed and water areas, communal wash racks, exercise pens, and parking. Parking is important because people can be transporting things from one place to another on their vehicles, that hitchhiker effect, like I mentioned earlier. Animal entry health requirements, I've mentioned that, and I believe a lot of people now, it's become commonplace that most equine events have that. Horse stabling, again, where are they all going to be housed, how are they going to be housed, proper ventilation, those kind of things. Stall sanitation, are the stalls disinfected between events? Is that something that the facility is going to plan to do as a normal practice, or is that something they're going to leave up to the people that come in for each event? If the facility is able to do some kind of sanitation to the stalls between events, that'll go a long way to protecting the biosecurity of that facility. Water sources, again, communal water sources not suggested. Where are those water sources located? How do people have access to them, and those kind of things should be thought about. Signage, this is important in terms of you want to let people know this is your isolation area. Facilities can put signs up, please don't pet the horses, to try to reduce that transmission of things. Any kind of signage that you think is appropriate that can help reduce your risks of things being spread can be beneficial. Vector and wildlife control, I've mentioned that on the on-farm stuff, that stays the same for event hosts for their biosecurity. If you're going to have a large event at your facility, it wouldn't hurt prior to the event to make sure that you've done any kind of mosquito mitigation that you can do, or fly control for the facility prior to people moving in, so that you just decrease the occurrence of those things during the event. Manure and waste disposal, I talked about that. You want to make sure that that's away from where the animals are being housed so that it doesn't attract those vectors again. How is feed going to be stored? Whether that's through any kind of vendor you might have at your facility or the feed that people are bringing in. How do you want that stored to reduce that rodent issue? Again, horse-to-horse contact, sometimes it's out of our control because the facility that you go to has stalls with slats in it, but if there's the ability to spread the horses out more so you don't necessarily have that horse-to-horse contact, that's a positive. One thing that you should consider is horse to other species contact. If that can be minimized, that's beneficial as well. Again, think about the isolation area. I went into a lot of detail on that in the previous slide. Having one and having it out of the way in a low foot traffic area is vital, so that if there was to be any kind of issue, the animal could be moved there and isolated to reduce the spread to other animals. And then that traffic control, vehicles as well as the foot traffic. Another thing that I didn't mention here is, it's tough to tell people this, but reduce dogs and cats and those kind of things at any kind of events can help, because a dog can go over, pick something up, bring it over into your stalling area. It's another way that these things can be spread from animal to animal. Perfect segue. Somebody asked what's recommended for disinfecting. That happens to be my next slide. So when it comes to disinfecting, there's some processes that are recommended. And one thing to keep in mind, the first thing you have to do before you disinfect the stall is you have to remove all the organic matter, dirt, manure, anything like that needs to be removed. And I mean, if that's on the walls need to be scrubbed. So you wash everything with a soap and water, some kind of detergent, whether that's recommended laundry detergent or dish soap. I mean, there's borax out there as a laundry detergent that can be used, and then all kinds of dish soaps. But oftentimes those things will do part of the disinfecting for you, but that has to occur before you can actually disinfect. Then you're going to allow it to dry after you scrub down the walls of, or whether this is the walls of a stall or whether this is your equipment. You need to wash it first before it can actually be disinfected. Allow it to dry, and then you apply your disinfectants. You want to make sure you use those according to label, because that's going to ensure that you have maximum efficiency. And something that people often forget is that adequate contact time with the surface. There's some disinfectants that you'd rinse off, and there's others that you'd leave, and depending on what you're battling, I've read different recommendations as to whether to rinse it or to just leave it on the surface. But that contact time is really important for it to actually do its job. Another consideration when disinfecting is the use of sunlight. If you've washed your buckets and all that kind of stuff for your horses, and one of the things that I'd recommend is labeling those buckets so that the same bucket goes back to the same horse all the time. And this is on farm. I guess I jumped backwards a little bit, but when disinfecting, wash it out, and then you can leave it outside in the sun to dry. That sun will often act as a natural disinfectant for some things. It's obviously not going to work on everything, but at least you're doing something there to increase some disinfecting activity. So some types of disinfectants. Everybody, there's the common household products, bleach and Lysol. I want to mention bleach here, and for you to understand, you need to look at some of the different types of disinfectants, because there are different things that are going to affect their ability to work appropriately. One of those things, bleach is not going to work in the presence of dirt or organic matter. Everybody thinks, oh, well, we'll just do bleach. If it's dirty, bleach is going to lose its effectiveness. It's not going to work. It becomes inactivated in the presence of organic matter. So you definitely need to think about that if bleach is a product that you're going to use. If you're just putting bleach out there on a dirty surface, you might as well just pour water on it. So if you do have a clean surface, or you're using bleach to disinfect tack and things like that, you're going to clean it first, as I mentioned on the previous slide. But you can use a mixture of 3/4 of a cup of bleach to a gallon of water to dilute it, and then use that. There's chlorides, there's and I'm going to butcher some of these names of some of these things, but phenolic based products, and Lysol is a phenolic based product, and they work on different things. For instance, viruses with what they call an envelope, and I could explain what an envelope is, but different viruses are either no envelope or they have an envelope. With envelopes, those are things like influenza and herpes. Detergents and disinfectants will work good on those. So your common, bleach and things like that will work good on those. So sometimes just the act of cleaning the stall with the detergent or dish soap will help. Other viruses that lack an envelope, such as a rotavirus, needs a phenolic-based product to be effective to disinfect that, and that would be something like Lysol is a phenolic product. Now, one thing that I saw caution you, if you have cats, barn cats and things like that, Lysol phenolic products are an irritant to cats. So just keep that in mind for whatever that's worth. So, there's also a variety of spray disinfectants out there. There's just a variety of things. Just any kind of disinfectant that you end up using, make sure that it kills viruses and bacteria, and you got to read on the label for that. I mentioned earlier hand sanitizers and wipes. Those can help, but remember, even those Clorox wipes and things like that, it's going to be predicated on how long it stays in contact with the surface and whether that surface is clean to begin with. But those, wipes like that and things can be useful if you're cleaning off shoes and boots. At least you're doing something to knock some of that off if you don't have a separate pair to wear from one place to another. Some actual product names that I ran across, a product called One Stroke Environ and Tektrol. And I'm not promoting one product or another. These are just things that I ran across. These products claim to still be effective in the presence of organic matter. I think it says slight or a little organic matter. I forget how it was actually worded, but they claim to be effective in the presence of some organic matter. Then there's also quaternary ammonium-based products. Rocol D is one of those, and that's another one that can be effective in the presence of organic matter. But again, you got to read and see what things these are effective against, whether it's certain types of bacteria or viruses and bacteria, or some viruses but not others. And if you do some searching on the internet, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of stuff on different types of disinfectants, and I'm only naming a few here. But you can find things. I found a really handy-dandy paper just called Cleaning and Disinfecting of Premises, and it's put out by APHIS. It's got a whole bunch of stuff listed in there. Talks about what they're effective against. It also talks about some common product names that they can be found under. I want to talk just a touch more about disinfectants real quick. Remind you it's important to remove soil and organic matter, snot, mucus, anything like that with a detergent first, and then you can do your disinfecting. Also, make sure that you read that the product claims include the spectrum of activity that you need it to. Read the labels carefully and always accurately calculate the dilutions and respect the recommended contact time. I think I've mentioned that a few times already. If you're really having to do a deep clean, make sure that you're wearing rubber boots, coveralls, protective gloves, and those kind of things. You can use like a toilet brush or some kind of scrub brush to get into nooks and crannies, and don't forget to get rid of cobwebs and any other kind of residual material that might be there. And it's not just the stall that's important to clean if you had some kind of an outbreak or something, but also the alleyway or any common areas, wash racks and things like that. I think those areas often get overlooked and forgotten about. I mean, you go to a show or someplace where you're going to be stalling your horse, you spend this time to disinfect your stall and clean it up a little bit, and then you go over to the wash rack or a tie rail and you tie it there without even thinking about it. You probably want to disinfect that too prior to tying your horse to that, so you just don't forget and get some of those kind of loophole areas in there. In summary, biosecurity, remember, is a part of a good herd health management plan, and isn't just it's not going to catch everything, but it's part of your overall plan. You're still going to have a disease outbreaks, but you want to reduce your risks. And then the time to implement biosecurity practices is now, before you have any kind of outbreak. It seems like everybody wants to think about these things once we have an outbreak of something, but in reality, if we could do more of this stuff on the front end, we'd reduce the occurrence of those outbreaks in the long run. So with that, if you guys have any other questions or anything like that, I'm open to it. And we do have a little survey again at the end here to see if we were able to help you guys out at all. But I think I got the questions that I saw below. Go ahead and do the survey that's up there now. And then if you guys have any other questions, please type those in for me. Otherwise, I thank you for your time, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your afternoon today to listen to me. And I can be contacted if any of you ever need to contact me. If you do a search for Colorado State University Extension in Arapahoe County, you'll be able to find my information. I'm not sure if I had it on the very first slide or not. This is being recorded so that, if you want to go back and reference it again, you can.
Do you have a resource?
Yeah, Ruth, if you can hear me, I had a resource page, and I wanted to make sure that they saw those resources that I had. So I don't know if we can go back to my presentation or not. There we go. Yeah. So here's some of my resources. I mentioned this. Let's see here. This continuity plan right here for equine events. Then here's the biosecurity toolkit I mentioned. Those are good resources. And then I think I have one more slide here. You guys had a chance to look at that. Here's the one from UC Davis right here. So hopefully you find that helpful. Any other questions? All right, I'm just going to hang on for a couple of minutes. If you guys have anything or think of anything, you're welcome to type those in there. I think I answered the two that were already there. And thank you very much.
Looks like we don't have any questions, so thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.